On a moonless night, where the sky hung like a heavy veil and shadows danced around like ancient specters, another season of the survival game began. The trees rose around the clearing like silent guardians, and the few leaves that stirred seemed to whisper dark secrets. In that endless darkness, where even the insects seemed hesitant to make a sound, 12 souls were handed over to chance, arranged like pieces on a board where the eyes of the elite, hidden behind screens and masks, monitored their every move. I, Morticia, the shadow that rests beside the dying, was there. I watched each glimmer of hope, every subtle hesitation, every fear disguised as courage. It was more than a game. It was a ritual where each trial served as a feast of suffering for the invisible elite, those who savored blood and pain like a sommelier tastes wine. I lurked, feeling each participant's pulse, waiting for the moment when life would start to fade from their eyes. When the participants were left in the clearing, each of the 12 glanced around, caught between fascination and apprehension. Some dared to exchange curious glances. Others held on to distrust as a shield. In the oppressive silence of the forest, the night's cold seemed to seep into their bones, sending a slight tremor even through the strongest. The emptiness around them was palpable, a feeling of solitude that already engulfed them like a premonition. Jack, the former Marine, had the sharp gaze of a man accustomed to danger, his eyes scanning every shadow, every inch of ground. His body was rigid, muscles taut like a beast on alert, and in his gaze was something deeper, a brutal loneliness that none there could understand. Jack had faced death in many forms, but he didn't know that now it watched him closely, far nearer than he imagined. Lisa, the nurse with a gentle and distant look, tried to hide the marks of accumulated fatigue. She carried a weary kindness, an almost illusory calm, as if she were there to heal wounds while concealing her own. Perhaps it was her way of escaping the internal void, filling it with others' pain. And though she didn't know, she was already my next potential target. Her soul glowed softly but unsteadily. Chloe, the young and charming actress, moved like a frightened butterfly, trying to maintain a lightness that didn't belong in that place. Her eyes sparkled, full of a desire for recognition, a fear of being forgotten, perhaps. Chloe believed this was her stage, the moment when she would capture the viewer's attention, but what she didn't know was that the audience wanted to see her broken, undone, ruined. They craved her tears, and little did she know that the true beauty they sought in her would be revealed through her suffering. David, the businessman with a cold gaze, observed everything with a glint of insatiable ambition. He saw each of the others as pieces, already plotting how to manipulate them, how to use them to his advantage. For David, this was a game of power and status, and he was ready to sacrifice anyone necessary to achieve glory. But what he didn't know was that the game was beyond anything he could ever control. Marcus, the calculating engineer, kept an impassive face while his eyes analyzed the surroundings as though he were calculating every possibility. He was the skeptic, the pragmatic one, the one who believed he was in control of his own mind. Within him, logic ruled over chaos, and he refused to believe in the unpredictable. But here, in this setting where I waited patiently, even reason would lose its place. Each of the 12 carried something, and I could feel their souls pulsing like small embers. For them, it was a survival game, a spectacle to win over the audience, but for me it was a dark vigil, a prelude to the end. The silence was oppressive, but it would soon be broken by the first trial, and I, Morticia, knew this was only the beginning. The loudspeaker boomed, announcing the first trial. The metallic voice reverberated through the clearing, and some of them shuddered, exchanging uneasy glances. Before them stood a dark swamp, shrouded in mist and filled with stagnant waters, dense and murky like an unrevealed secret. In the foul mud, treacherous roots and submerged logs lay patiently in wait, like silent predators. At the center, an ancient totem, blackened with age, hung on a rusty structure, a silent marker for the first reward, keys that could guarantee a bit of rest that night. Jack, the ex-Marine, was the first to plunge in. With silent determination, he moved forward through the mud, moving with precision. His steps were quick and firm, and for a moment he almost seemed invincible, until the filthy, stagnant water revealed a sharp log, hidden like a deadly trap. A muffled crack sounded as his leg pierced through the log, and warm blood began to seep out, mixing with the mud. He clenched his teeth, his jaw trembling with searing pain, but he didn't let out a single cry. The pain was almost unbearable, a needle shooting up his leg, but he pressed on, each step a silent struggle. In the distance, Chloe let out a shrill scream, covering her mouth with her hands as she saw the blood staining the muddy water around Jack. She couldn't hide the horror on her face, and desperation soon began to take hold. But Jack, ignoring her terrified gaze, only murmured under his breath. "This is nothing," he muttered to himself as he struggled out of the suffocating mud, dragging himself to the edge of the swamp. His body ached as though each muscle was being torn, and the cold mud clung to his skin like a deadly caress. He could barely feel his wounded leg. The pain was a constant presence, a loyal companion that insisted on reminding him of his own fragility. Chloe followed close behind, but at the sight of the blood mixed with mud, she let out another sharp scream, her face contorting in horror. Her scream echoed across the swamp, and somewhere far away in the safety of their homes, the viewers' eyes sparkled with excitement, smiles forming as they watched, eager and captivated by another's suffering. Every drop of blood, every wound was a visual delight, a spectacle that satisfied their morbid hunger for drama and destruction. "Jack, are you all right?" Chloe's voice trembled, but her gaze was fixed on his bloody leg. She knew her concern was useless, but she couldn't look away from that brutal wound. He nodded, refusing to express the intense pain he felt, keeping his face hard. Pride and determination were all he had left, an armor against the vulnerability he felt in her presence. Across the swamp, Lisa was struggling to help Andrew, who was caught in a submerged root. He flailed, panic etched on his aged face, and the more he tried to free himself, the deeper he was ensnared. The root seemed to have a life of its own, an unyielding arm pulling him into the depths. Each of his movements brought a pain that Lisa could feel as if it were her own, a pain that pierced her very soul. Then came the snap, a horrific final sound. Lisa watched, powerless, as Andrew's leg was grotesquely trapped. His skin and tendons stretched and gave way until the swamp, now tinged with blood and covered in a shroud of mud and despair, became a stage for muffled screams of terror. Lisa tried to hold back her tears, but they slipped down bitterly, reflecting the helplessness that consumed her. When, finally, the group emerged from the swamp, their faces were marked by exhaustion and horror. Yet somehow a foolish, almost mocking bravery echoed in their voices. They had barely escaped the swamp, but the flame of survival still burned, a resistance that bordered on absurd. Gathered around a makeshift fire, the flames cast strange and unsettling shadows across their faces, highlighting the cuts and bruises they had accumulated. They tried to warm themselves and clean their wounds with scraps of cloth torn from their own clothes, the rough fabric scraping against their sore skin. "This is just the beginning," declared David with a cold, smug smile. "If this is the worst they've got, I think we're good." Lisa stared at him with disbelief, her eyes red with tears and her body still trembling from the effort and anguish. "David, did you hear the screams? This wasn't just a normal trial. Someone could have died." Her voice was low, but it carried a frightening intensity. David, indifferent, shrugged as he chewed on a small portion of food, the scarce ration they had been given. In that moment, he seemed detached from the pain and suffering of others, as if watching from afar, distant, without a hint of compassion. That night, each of them retreated to a restless sleep, trapped in a dark place where despair dwelled. Yet far beyond what they could see, in a cold room filled with monitors, figures watched their every move, every fearful expression, every whisper around the fire. Those calculating eyes saw no people, only variables, pieces in a cruel game. There, among screens and cameras, they discussed strategies and adjusted their plans with chilling precision. At dawn, a new instruction echoed through the loudspeakers, its metallic voice slicing through the silence and chilling the participants' skin. Exhaustion was etched into their faces, and their heavy eyes betrayed the few hours of rest they'd had. The next challenge would take place in the old abandoned house, a deteriorated structure standing like a shadow of past nightmares. The house had peeling walls, shattered windows, and doors that creaked like mournful cries. It seemed to breathe, as if hiding secrets in its dark depths. Unaware of what awaited them, the participants were led inside the gloomy house. They were to spend the night there in complete darkness. But what they didn't know were the sadistic tricks meticulously planned for them. The house was equipped with hidden speakers, set to emit unsettling sounds at unpredictable intervals, piercing screams, sinister whispers, and eerie laughter that would echo through the hallways like invisible presences. Hidden panels in the floor would also release bursts of heat or vibrations beneath their feet, making them feel as though something was slithering below. As night fell, fear began to seep into the heavy air. Lisa clutched her coat tightly, as if that fabric was her only defense against the invisible horror around her. She stared into the darkness, her eyes wide. "Is anyone else hearing that?" The whispers, she murmured, her voice trembling, barely more than a thread. Chloe, seated in a corner of the room, began to cry silently, hugging her knees as if she could shrink away and disappear. Her body shook, every part of her soul longing to escape that place. "I want out. I can't take this anymore," she whispered, her voice choked. Chloe didn't know if her companions could hear her, but those words echoed in her mind, over and over, like an unending internal lament. Marcus, the engineer, tried to calm the others with rational arguments, whispering to himself that it was all just a setup, a trick by the organizers. But the cold sweat running down his forehead betrayed the fear he could barely admit, even to himself. Suddenly, a shrill scream shattered the silence, a desperate, horrifying sound that seemed to rip through the darkness of the house. They all flinched, eyes darting in every direction, until they realized the scream came from Andrew. They rushed over to him, but when they found him, he was already lying still, his glassy eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, frozen in a final terror. Morticia, felt his soul slowly drift from his body, a fragile essence loosening from the flesh, leaving behind an expression of fear. I welcomed him into my cold, eternal embrace, as the living struggled to process the horror of his loss. The next morning, the group was even more shattered. No explanation was given by the production team, who watched them from afar, indifferent, as the shock and despair on the survivors' faces unfolded like a silent symphony on their screens. The audience continued to thrill with each emotion, mesmerized by the emptiness in Andrew's eyes, the anguished expressions of the survivors. It was as if they were in a trance, immersed in a theater of horrors where every death and every wound was a feast for their insatiable souls. The participants knew their journey was only beginning, yet none of them could predict just how far the game would take them. The shadows around seemed to move with wills of their own, whispering secrets and laughing in mockery, as I, Morticia, watched them. In the third trial, the setting was a dark, deep pit, like the mouth of a hungry monster waiting patiently. In the dim light, thin wooden platforms stretched out in a precarious path the participants had to cross to reach the other side. Beneath these platforms lay a sea of embers, burning with deadly intensity. The flames danced, rising in waves of heat, as if they yearned for a sacrifice. It was a living hell, emitting a heat so fierce that it made the air vibrate, scorching the faces and hands of the participants even before they reached the edge. The heat seeped into their bones, a grim warning of what awaited them at the slightest misstep. Chloe, upon facing the abyss, felt her heart pounding in her chest. Sweat trickled down her forehead, mingling with the tears she was trying to hold back. She breathed quickly, panting, the intense heat drying her throat, suffocating her with an invisible force. She looked down but immediately shut her eyes when she saw the embers below, hungry, pulsing as if they had a life of their own. The thought of falling there, of being consumed in a fiery embrace, made her mind spin in a fog of terror. Her body trembled, and the muscles in her legs seemed to lose all strength. But she had no choice. David passed by her with a cruel smile and whispered, in a tone dripping with provocation and contempt, "This place isn't for everyone. If you want out, maybe it's better to just throw yourself in and end it already." Those words sank deep into Chloe's mind. She felt her blood boil for an instant, a mixture of anger and shame burning inside her. She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, but something within her ignited. A strength hidden until now. Death down there in the embers seemed to whisper to her like a constant presence. But she would not yield to that shadow. With an effort that made her groan in pain, Chloe managed to take a few more steps on the fragile wood, the planks creaking beneath her weight. Each step was a risk, a thin line between life and death. Jack, always the last to cross, moved forward with calculated steps, muscles tense, eyes alert to the treacherous movement of the platforms. Unlike many, he maintained a cold, almost mechanical focus. When he finally reached the other side, he allowed himself to breathe a little easier, feeling his heart slow down. The others also relaxed, even if only for a brief moment, as if they had conquered their own hell. Then a snap echoed through the air. Everyone immediately turned. Chloe was standing on one of the planks that was slowly beginning to give way. Her eyes widened in terror as the wood groaned, the fibers breaking beneath her feet. She screamed, the sound reverberating in the pit like an echo of her own sentence. And in a second, her figure collapsed into the abyss, swallowed by the flames. Morticia felt her call. As she fell, her desperate scream was a cry of life and fear. I was there, present in her pain, in the heat consuming her skin, in the muscles contracting in agony. The flames engulfed her in a final dance, her body devoured in an insatiable crackling until her flesh gave way and silence fell. Chloe dissolved in the agony, and I accompanied her until her presence faded into absolute void. The group, now even more diminished, remained adrift, nerves exhausted and faces sickly pale. They survived by sheer force of fate, but, in essence, they were already broken. A few more nights passed. The lack of sleep, the persistent aches in their bodies, and the constant risk of death had turned the tension into a permanent state. Every whisper, every shadow seemed an imminent threat, and madness lingered silently, ready to settle in their weakened minds. It was then that Jack and Lisa, seeking a way out or some answer amidst the chaos, ended up exploring an area where they shouldn't have been. The dark walls of the place exuded a stench of mold and decay, a hidden corridor that seemed purposefully left there, like a trap for the curious. With hesitant steps, they entered the labyrinth until they stumbled upon a room that, at first glance, seemed abandoned. But when they turned on a faint flashlight, the space revealed something shocking. Screens glowed softly, showing recordings of every moment of the program. There, in a network of hidden cameras, every angle of the island was exposed. The screens displayed the anguish, the fear, the faces twisted in pain. The trials, the injuries, Chloe's very death. Everything was documented, shown in cold, merciless detail. It wasn't just a reality show, it was constant observation, a meticulous study of every human reaction, every scream of pain, every second of suffering. But the cameras revealed something even more horrific. In a live broadcast, men and women in white lab coats could be seen observing everything from a control room, taking notes on clipboards, discussing each detail as if they were analyzing animals in an experiment. They were scientists' cold, inhuman voices that treated agony and despair as data, as variables in a complex and monstrous equation. Lisa recoiled, her hands trembling. She let herself collapse onto the floor, unable to process what she was seeing. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the screen that showed Chloe's death replaying over and over. This can't be real. They're using us as guinea pigs. Jack felt rage boiling inside him, his face twisted in an expression of barely restrained fury. His fists clenched so tightly that his nails pierced the palms of his hands. He fought to keep from screaming, to maintain control in this moment of brutal revelation. "It's an experiment," he replied, his voice low and bitter. "We're lab rats." The truth was a fatal blow, a revelation that stripped bare the entire essence of this hell. They weren't just participating in a survival program. They were prisoners of a sadistic elite, an invisible audience paying to watch human agony as the pinnacle of entertainment. The deaths, the blood, the fears, and nightmares. Everything was carefully orchestrated, designed to maximize torture, pain, and spectacle. Beyond those cameras, the cold, calculating eyes of the scientists watched and took notes, measuring the limits of human suffering. Pain was not a side effect. It was the goal, the core of everything. The elite wanted to see how far the participants could be broken, how much pain they could endure before they succumbed and became mere fragments of a macabre experiment. From that moment on, reality held a new weight for the remaining participants. They were merely toys in the hands of something greater, pieces in a sadistic and meticulous game. With each new trial, with every new scream of pain, I, Morticia, waited for them, for I knew that, for each one, the end was already written.